judgment of Paul before he went to Rome. They took him from Jerusalem to Caesarea. There was the judgment before the governor, and then from there he went to Rome.
They were medics who were militarily trained. They were most noted for fighting in the Crusades, but they came as military medics in this particular area of Galilee. This was the base of St. John's. There was also another order of Crusades called the Knights Templar. They were absolute brutal butchers. We normally think today of Islam as the brutal barbarian religion. In those days, the Crusades were more barbaric, far more barbaric than Muslims. Most of the Muslims were essentially Turkish Muslims. Europe was in the Dark Ages, Greco-Roman civilization declined to nothing, while the Eastern Roman Empire, after the fragmentation, was now what was left of the Byzantine Empire. That was still having remnants of Greco-Roman civilization still existed in the East, particularly Istanbul. But the Crusades, leaving Europe, went through Istanbul and totally ransacked it, and eventually reached here. They killed everybody. They killed Muslims, they killed Jews, and they killed Eastern Orthodox Christians, trying to force them to come back under the Roman papacy. Here in the Middle East, there were some sects of the Eastern Orthodox Church who did go back under them, like the Maronite Catholics. They, at the point of a sword, returned to the Roman Catholic Church. There are Eastern rites of the Latin Church. They don't use Latin, they use Greek. They look like the Eastern Orthodox, but they're under the papacy. This all goes back to the Crusades. Again, these men were more barbaric often than were probably most of the time, more barbaric than were the Muslims. The Crusades went on for the 12th, 13th century. They were finally defeated at about 1290, 1291, 1292 was the end of it. But the final evacuation from the Crusades happened here from the Crusader port adjacent to Crusader Fortress. Today it's like a little fishing port on the other side. And as they were going, some of the Crusades were trying to hold off the final Muslim onslaught that followed the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, when Salah ad-Din, the Islamic general, defeated the Crusades near the Sea of Galilee at the Horns of Hattin. They reached Acco, and the Crusades were trying to hold them off, but they pilfered everything. They were taking all the gold, all the treasures, any kind of religious artifact they could possibly lay their hands on, and get them on boats and took them back to Italy. Most of the Crusades came from England and France. Others came from Italy and Germany. Richard the Lionhearted, that whole story, against that background, they would have arrived here or in Caesarea. In some boats, up to 80% of the Crusades died of things like scurvy, malaria, other diseases. More died most of the time just arriving here than died in the initial battles. They thought the Muslims were initially invincible. The Muslims' army had sheets of fabric, multiple sheets of fabric, so when you shot an arrow, you'd have a spinning effect, and the fabric would get twined around the arrow, and it wouldn't kill them, and they'd keep fighting. They thought they had some kind of supernatural potion. Then they began fighting in closer combat using daggers and short swords, and then they realized that the Muslims were not invincible. Finally, they prevailed and established the Latin kingdom. Now, most people would follow the traditional party line, which says the Crusades came to liberate the Holy Land because Christian pilgrims were being harassed, were being disturbed somehow by the Muslim Turks. That is indeed somewhat true to a point, but there is another truth. The agricultural economy of Europe was being revolutionized by the spice trade. The spice trade came all the way from as far as India. Trade routes from the east, from Persia, from India, those things came to Mediterranean ports like Acco, and either could continue on the old Roman routes further north, or could go by sea from Acco and Caesarea to Europe. Spice trades were big business. Food could be made to last longer and taste better. You had something in Italy with rival banking families, the Borgia families, the Medici families, the banking families of Italy. You see this like Piazza Rialto in Venice, places like this were the banking capitals of Italy. The Vatican was not yet the capital of the Roman Church. At that time, it was the Latreno, the Lateran palace. and it was basically an institution of international banking. So the rival families of Italy always vied to have their man as pope. Sometimes it'd be 2 and 3 popes at the same time from rival banking families. Whoever had the most muscle, the biggest army, the most financial and political backing would come out on top, and he would excommunicate the other 2 popes, calling them anti-popes. One pope actually disinterred, dug up the corpse of his predecessor from a rival family, dressed him up in his Sunday best, his vestments, and put him on trial, pronounced an anathema on him. Crusades were about controlling the spice trade to the east. There was an underlying financial motive. Religion is good propaganda. Religion was indeed a factor, but it was not the only factor. It's sort of like Northern Ireland. People will use religion as propaganda in the cause. People today in the Middle East will use religion as propaganda in the cause, but there's underlying political factors, underlying economic factors, underlying what you see happening in popular history. I don't like Voltaire, but he was right about one thing. History is the lie everybody agrees on, and if you want to hear a lie, it is the Crusades. I don't say this to offend anyone, but if you want to know what a Roman Catholic world would look like, look at what a Roman Catholic world was like. They had 12 centuries to show what they would do if they had their way. Look at the Dark Ages. That was Roman Catholicism. The first countries in Europe to democratize after the Reformation were the first ones to reject Catholicism. The last countries to democratize were the ones who remained Catholic. You had a struggle between the Eastern Byzantine Empire and the Western Latin Empire after the Roman Empire split between the Greek-speaking East, the Latin-speaking West. The conflict you see today in Yugoslavia between the Serbs and the Croats goes back to that time. Yugoslavia became, after the Crusades, the focal point of the conflict. The Saracens, who were the Muslims, twice reached the outskirts of Vienna, going through the Yugoslav, because that was where the schism was between the Latin and Greek halves of the Roman Empire. One following the Eastern Church, one following the Latin Church, one following the Patriarch of Constantinople, the other following the Pope. The Crusades were an effort, thirdly, to reunite the Roman Empire under a papacy and to force the Eastern Orthodox Church, what was left of the Byzantine Empire, to come back under the Western Italian papacy. So that's what they tried to do. They tried to force these people to come back under it. So the war was not just against the Muslims. They absolutely butchered the Jews, but they butchered even other people claiming to be Christian. And I mean butchered. It went on for multiple crusades. The First Crusade, the Second Crusade, the Third Crusade, the Fourth Crusade. Finally, they get down to the point where it was actually depopulating sections of Europe and was causing political instability in Europe. The legend of Robin Hood in England comes against this background with King John and so on. So many men had been away in the Crusades or dying in the Crusades. It began to cause political instability in Europe. It got to the point they were having children's crusades. And they called him a saint, Saint Bernard. No wonder they named a dog after him. They actually established children's crusades, and they began sending kids here to fight Islamic armies, butchering the youth. Now today, we saw in the war between Iran and Iraq, you had a genocidal extermination of children. Well, then it was so-called Christians doing it. An ugly history. Acco was central to what was happening. It was the main Crusader port on the north. Now, biblically, it has very ancient sources. We have references to it in the Amarna text and to various Egyptian manuscripts. The Ras Shemana text, the Amarna letters, are very old Semitic manuscripts, not Jewish but Semitic, but do confirm much of the historical and literary background of the Hebrew scriptures, first mentioned in those pre-Jewish ancient sources. This was also one of the cities given by King Solomon to Hiram as a token of friendship between Jew and Gentile. Remember, the period of Solomon's reign, Solomon's name comes from the Hebrew word shalom, peace, shlomo. Peace between Jew and Gentile is one of the things that prefigure the millennium. And this was one of the 10 cities that was given by King Solomon to Hiram, king of Tyre, who was a Phoenician who became a monotheistic believer in the Jewish God. It continues on. It was also given to the tribe of Asher in the book of Joshua and in the book of Judges, but the tribe of Asher failed to conquer it. Later, with the fragmentation of Alexander the Great's empire, this city was named after one of the generals, Ptolemy. And that's what it's called in the New Testament. In the book of Acts chapter 21, when Paul leaves on his way on his final journey to Rome, the first stop he makes along the way is here. It didn't spend long here, probably a day or two, and then he was off again, but this was the place where Paul came. These ruins here are not biblical. They are essentially medieval and post-medieval. But it's probably the best Crusader ruins I know of this size anyway.